2 inches of glass caught the sun for less than a second. Enough time to die. Somewhere along the Matanikau River, in late October 1942, a Marine rifleman with a Springfield fitted with an 8-power Unertl scope shifted his position in the undergrowth. The scope's forward objective lens, 30 millimeters of uncoated, unshielded optical glass, rotated through a sliver of equatorial light, filtering down through the canopy. The flash lasted maybe half a heartbeat. Across 80 yards of dense jungle, a Japanese soldier perched in a banyan tree saw it. He didn't see the Marine. He saw the reflection. That distinction mattered, because the Marine never saw anything at all. The Arisaka round hit him before the sound arrived. If someone in your family carried a rifle through those jungles, Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Peleliu, any of it, this channel exists because of them. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and if you know a story from those campaigns, put it in the comments. Those details matter more than you think. The Unertl scope should have been a decisive advantage. 8-power magnification, in a war where most engagements in the Pacific jungle happened at ranges under 100 yards. Marines trained at Camp Matthews and Camp Elliott had learned to shoot with those optics under California sun, punching targets at distances that made iron sight shooters look primitive. The Corps invested real money in those scopes. Each Unertl cost more than the rifle it sat on. And the glass performed. In clear conditions, at range, with time to settle into a position, the scope turned a good marksman into something closer to an executioner. The jungle didn't offer clear conditions or range, and it almost never offered time. What it offered instead, what nobody back in San Diego had fully accounted for, amounted to a targeting beacon strapped to your rifle. The exposed objective lens on the Unertl had no sunshade, no kill flash device, no anti-reflective coating worth mentioning by 1942 standards. In the open terrain of a European battlefield, a sniper could manage that vulnerability through careful positioning relative to the sun. On Guadalcanal, light didn't behave the way it did on a firing range. It came from everywhere. It scattered through moisture-heavy air, bounced off wet leaves, penetrated canopy gaps at unpredictable angles. A scope that stayed dark for 20 minutes could flare white-hot when a cloud shifted. Japanese defenders, dug in, stationary, patient in ways that drove American officers to frustration, had every advantage in spotting that flare first. They occupied fixed positions with known sight lines, and they waited. The Marine with the scope had to move to find his target. Movement plus exposed glass plus equatorial sun created a problem that no amount of marksmanship training could solve. The after-action reports from 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal contain a detail that stops you cold. Unit leaders began noting that Marines carrying scoped rifles drew fire at rates disproportionate to their numbers. The scope wasn't helping them find Japanese positions faster than Japanese observers found them. One intelligence summary from the campaign noted that enemy snipers appeared to be deliberately hunting Marines with optical sights, the phrase used in the report. Whether Japanese doctrine specifically trained soldiers to prioritize scoped rifles remains unclear. The records don't say, but the effect showed up in casualty patterns that battalion commanders couldn't ignore. Scoped rifles made their carriers visible in triple canopy jungle against an entrenched enemy who excelled at concealment and had no intention of moving. Visibility killed faster than magnification saved. This created a problem that cut against everything the Marine Corps believed about precision shooting. The Corps had built its identity around marksmanship since before the First World War. The scout sniper concept, one round, one kill, delivered from distance with optical superiority, sat near the center of how Marines understood their own excellence. And now, the jungle had turned that excellence into a liability. Not because the Marines couldn't shoot. They could shoot better than almost anyone alive. The problem had nothing to do with skill. It had to do with physics, the behavior of light through uncoated glass in an equatorial forest where your enemy refused to present himself at the ranges your equipment demanded. To understand why the Corps made a decision that looked like a step backward, pulling scopes off rifles in the most dangerous theater of the war, you have to understand what replaced magnification, when magnification started getting people killed. John Unertl Sr. bent over a lathe in his Pittsburgh shop in 1940 and ground a lens that would change how the Marine Corps killed people. His customers weren't government procurement officers. They were competitive shooters, the small, obsessive community of men who fired at Camp Perry every summer and argued about minute of angle groupings the way other men argued about baseball. Unertl built scopes for that crowd, one at a time, by hand, with tolerances that mass manufacturers couldn't match and didn't try to. The scope that came out of that shop, the 8-power fixed magnification model with external target-style adjustments, belonged on a bench rest at a 1,000-yard competition, not a battlefield. The difference between those two environments is not trivial. The entire design philosophy assumed a shooter who had time to settle, adjust elevation and windage with exposed turret knobs, and fire from a stable platform at a known distance. The eye relief sat at a precise 3 inches. The field of view narrowed to roughly 4 degrees. Everything about the optic rewarded patience and punished haste. The Marine Corps looked at those characteristics and saw perfection. Their reasoning made sense on paper. Marine doctrine since the 1920s had emphasized that every Marine functioned as a rifleman first, and the best rifleman earned a designation that carried real weight in the Corps hierarchy. Scout snipers represented the sharpest expression of that culture. Men selected for shooting ability, trained in fieldcraft, equipped with the finest optics available, and expected to deliver surgical kills at ranges that demoralized the enemy. The Unertl scope gave those men something no iron sight could provide: the ability to read a target's rank insignia at 400 yards, to distinguish a radio operator from an ordinary rifleman by his equipment, to pick officers out of formations with a confidence that bordered on casual, and to do all of it from distances the enemy couldn't answer. At Quantico and Camp Matthews, the results looked devastating. Marine snipers with Unertl glass consistently produced shot groups at 600 yards that infantry soldiers couldn't replicate at 200. The scope's optical clarity — Unertl ground his own lenses from high-quality German-sourced blanks stockpiled before the war — exceeded anything the Army's procurement system offered. Each scope underwent individual testing before it left Pittsburgh. Unertl rejected units that didn't meet his personal standard, which meant the Marines received optics that performed closer to scientific instruments than military hardware. The assumption, then, seemed reasonable. Put the world's best marksmen behind the world's best glass, and they would dominate any battlefield. Nobody in the pre-war planning apparatus spent adequate time asking what happened when the battlefield didn't cooperate. The training ranges in California offered open sight lines, predictable light, measured distances, and targets that didn't shoot back. Jungle warfare, the kind the Corps would face across the Pacific starting in August 1942, offered none of those things. But the Corps had limited jungle experience before Guadalcanal. The banana wars in Nicaragua and Haiti had involved some close-terrain fighting, though nothing resembling the dense triple canopy forests of the Solomon Islands. Planning documents from early 1942 reveal an institutional confidence in the scoped rifle that reads, with hindsight, like a man bringing a surgeon's scalpel to a knife fight in a dark room. The Springfield M1903 A4 itself compounded the problem in ways the Corps hadn't fully tested under combat conditions. Mounting the Unertl required removing the standard iron sights entirely on most configurations. A Marine carrying a scoped Springfield couldn't quickly transition to iron sights if the scope fogged, and in 98% humidity, fogging happened constantly, or if an engagement broke out at a distance where 8-power magnification turned a human target into an unreadable blur of green and brown. Below 30 yards, the scope became actively worse than no optic at all. The narrow field of view meant a sniper scanning jungle undergrowth saw roughly the equivalent of looking through a paper towel tube. Fast target acquisition, the kind required when a Japanese soldier appeared for 2 seconds between trees at 50 yards, ranged from difficult to impossible. Unertl built a magnificent instrument for a type of war the Pacific refused to provide. Lens coatings available in 1942 couldn't suppress reflections adequately. Fixed 8-power magnification couldn't adapt to engagement distances that shifted from 15 yards to 150 within the same patrol. External adjustment knobs snagged on vines and shifted 0 when Marines crawled through undergrowth. And the objective lens, that beautiful 30-millimeter circle of Pittsburgh ground glass, caught every stray photon the equatorial sun threw at it and sent it straight back toward anyone watching. The Japanese on Guadalcanal noticed before the Marines did. A Japanese Army manual circulated in 1938, translated by Allied intelligence only after Guadalcanal, too late to matter, devoted 11 pages to the identification of enemy optical equipment in jungle terrain. 11 pages. Nothing on shooting technique or ballistics, on spotting glass. The document, recovered from a dead officer's kit on Cape Esperance and forwarded to the intelligence section at Fleet Marine Force Pacific, laid out a detection methodology that treated the jungle canopy as a darkroom and any reflective surface as a developing photograph. Japanese snipers received instruction on how sunlight behaved at different times of day through different densities of foliage. They learned to distinguish lens flare from water reflection, from wet metal, from the sheen on a sweating face. The manual included hand-drawn diagrams showing the cone of reflection produced by a circular objective lens at various angles to the sun, crude by optical engineering standards, but operationally precise enough to tell a soldier perched in a tree exactly where to look when light entered the canopy from the northeast at 0800 hours versus noon. This approach reflected something deeper than tactical cleverness. The Imperial Japanese Army built its jungle doctrine around a core assumption that inverted Western military logic. The soldier who shoots first loses. Movement generates noise. Noise generates attention. Attention generates fire. Fire generates muzzle flash. And muzzle flash, in dense vegetation, where sound bounces unpredictably, gives away position faster than any scope reflection. Japanese sniper training at the Nakano School and at infantry replacement depots throughout the home islands drilled patience as a combat skill with the same intensity that Camp Matthews drilled trigger control. A Japanese sniper on Guadalcanal might occupy a single firing position in a banyan tree for 72 hours before taking his first shot. Cold rice kept him fed. Urine went into a container strapped to his leg. His rifle stayed still until he had identified not just a target, but the precise moment when firing would not reveal him. A gust of wind through the canopy, a burst of machine gun fire elsewhere on the line, a mortar impact close enough to mask the crack of his Arisaka. Against that kind of discipline, the Unertl scope functioned as a gift. The Japanese soldier didn't need to find the Marine. He needed to find the lens. That distinction only sounds academic. In practice, it changed everything. A Marine using fieldcraft correctly, face painted, uniform blending with undergrowth, body motionless, could disappear into the jungle floor at 40 yards. The human eye struggles to pick a camouflage shape out of organic clutter, but glass doesn't behave like organic material. It produces a specular reflection, a point source flash that the human visual system, evolved over millennia to detect exactly that kind of anomaly, registers instantly. A Japanese observer scanning a tree line didn't need to identify a human silhouette. He watched for a single bright point that lasted a fraction of a second, noted its position, and waited for it to recur. 2 flashes from the same location confirmed an optic. 3 confirmed a stationary shooter. The 4th flash never came, because by then, the Arisaka round had already left the barrel. Japanese after-action documents captured later in the war, on Saipan, on Iwo Jima, reference a targeting hierarchy that placed scoped rifles near the top, alongside radio operators and officers displaying rank insignia. The logic ran cold and simple. A scoped rifle meant a trained marksman, and a trained marksman killed more effectively than 10 ordinary riflemen. Eliminating him first produced disproportionate tactical value. One captured training document from the Kwantung Army used a phrase that translates roughly as, "the bright eye sees nothing," a reference to the paradox that the scope which extended a sniper's vision also announced his presence to anyone trained to look. Washington had access to fragments of Japanese tactical doctrine through signals intelligence and captured documents as early as mid-1942. Ultra intercepts from the South Pacific contained references to Japanese sniper employment that, read carefully, hinted at the observation-first methodology. The problem sat in translation backlogs and institutional priorities. Cryptanalysts focused on fleet movements, order of battle, supply schedules, the strategic material that won campaigns. A field manual's 11 pages on lens reflection detection didn't compete for attention against intercepts revealing carrier deployments. By the time translated copies reached the Marine divisions already fighting on Guadalcanal, battalion commanders had figured out the problem the hard way. Their snipers kept dying with pristine, unfired Springfields beside them, and Unertl scopes still holding perfect zero. The math never worked. 8-power magnification at 50 yards produces an image equivalent to looking at something 6 yards away, close enough to count the buttons on a man's shirt, far too close to track movement through dense undergrowth. A Japanese soldier crossing a gap between two trees at that distance occupied the Unertl's field of view for less than a quarter of a second. The Marine behind the scope saw a green-brown streak. The Marine next to him, using iron sights, saw a man. That inversion, the naked eye outperforming the optic, defied everything the Corps had trained for. But Guadalcanal's engagement geometry made it inevitable. 1st Marine Division's operations along the Matanicao, at Edson's Ridge, through the coconut groves west of Henderson Field, produced firefights where the median distance between opposing shooters dropped below 75 yards. Some contacts happened at 30, a few at 15. At those ranges, magnification didn't clarify targets, it obliterated context. A sniper scanning through 8-power glass saw bark texture, individual leaves, the veins on a fern frond. What he couldn't see, what the scope's 4-degree field of view physically prevented him from seeing, amounted to everything around the target zone. Peripheral threats vanished. A flanking movement 20 degrees off his sightline might as well have occurred on another island. The Marines who survived Guadalcanal's sniper war adapted before anyone issued an order telling them to. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell Page, the same Page who manned a machine gun at Edson's Ridge and received the Medal of Honor for it, noted that experienced Marines began wrapping their scope lenses with strips of cloth torn from undershirts, leaving only a narrow slit for the objective lens. Crude, effective enough to reduce the reflection cone by maybe 60%. Other snipers started carrying their scoped Springfields on their backs and borrowing M1 Garands from riflemen when contact seemed imminent. A few removed the Unertl entirely and stashed it in their packs, fighting with iron sights until they reached terrain open enough to justify remounting the glass. The institutional pride attached to carrying a scoped rifle, the visible mark of a scout sniper's elite status, collided with the practical reality that the scope attracted Japanese fire the way a lit cigarette attracted attention at night. Battalion-level after-action reports from November and December 1942 document the shift in language that doesn't require interpretation. One company commander in the 7th Marines wrote that his scoped rifles had become a net tactical liability in close jungle. Another report from the 5th Marines recorded that a sniper team of 2 men drew concentrated fire within minutes of occupying a position along the Matanicao, fire that ceased when they withdrew and resumed when they returned to the same sector with the same equipment. The Japanese weren't guessing. They identified the optic, marked the position, and waited for reoccupation. The Marines tested this by sending a rifleman with an unscoped Springfield into the same spot. No fire. Sources conflict on whether this represented a deliberate experiment or a coincidence that someone thought to document. The lesson cost lives before anyone wrote it down. In triple canopy jungle at engagement ranges between 50 and 100 yards, the Unertl 8-power scope provided zero tactical advantage that an experienced marksman with iron sights couldn't replicate. A good Marine shooter with a standard Springfield or an M1 could hit a man-sized target at 75 yards with mechanical certainty. The scope added nothing at that distance except a slower acquisition time, a narrower field of view, a fogging problem that 1942 anti-fog compounds couldn't solve in 98% humidity, and the part that killed people, a 30mm glass beacon broadcasting the shooter's location to an enemy specifically trained to detect it. The Japanese had found and exploited a vulnerability that American planners never anticipated because American planners never fought in jungle dense enough to expose it. Every assumption behind the scoped rifle program, long sight lines, stable shooting positions, engagements measured in hundreds of yards, optical superiority translating directly to lethality, collapsed on Guadalcanal within weeks. The scope didn't fail as an optical instrument. Unertl's glass remained superb. It failed as a system matched against an environment, an enemy, and a counter doctrine that no one in the program had accounted for. What the Marines needed wasn't better glass. They needed to stop thinking about the problem as a marksmanship question at all. 30 millimeters. That's the diameter of the Unertl's objective lens. The front element, the one facing the target, the one collecting light so the shooter could see. Roughly the width of a quarter. In a competition setting, that aperture pulled in enough light to produce a bright, sharp image at long range without bloating the scope's profile. On a bench rest in Pennsylvania, it performed flawlessly. In the Solomon Islands, it performed like a signal mirror. The physics aren't complicated. Light strikes a glass surface. A portion passes through, the rest reflects back. The percentage that reflects depends on the glass composition, the angle of incidence, and whether anyone applied an anti-reflective coating. Unertl's lenses carried no coating. Magnesium fluoride coatings existed by 1942. Zeiss had pioneered them in the 1930s, and American optical firms, including Bausch and Lomb, had begun experimenting with single-layer fluoride deposits for military binoculars. But Unertl's shop ran as a one-man precision operation, not an industrial optical house. He ground lenses. He didn't vapor deposit thin films in vacuum chambers. The technology required equipment he didn't own and expertise outside his trade. So the objective lens that left Pittsburgh reflected approximately 4% of incoming light off its front surface. 4% sounds negligible. Under the conditions of equatorial jungle warfare, it produced a visible flash at distances exceeding 300 yards, far beyond the engagement ranges where the scope provided any tactical benefit. The geometry mattered as much as the coating. A hooded objective lens, one recessed inside a cylindrical sunshade, extending 2 or 3 inches forward of the glass, limits the angles at which direct sunlight can reach the front element. German Zielvier scopes on the Eastern Front used exactly this design. So did Japanese Type 97 sniper scopes, which featured a built-in sunshade as standard. The Unertl had no hood. Its objective lens sat flush with the end of the scope tube, fully exposed to any light source within a 180-degree hemisphere in front of the shooter. In open terrain, a sniper could manage this by keeping the sun behind him. Basic fieldcraft taught at every school. In jungle, sunlight didn't arrive from one direction. It filtered through canopy gaps, reflected off wet leaves, bounced between tree trunks in patterns that shifted as clouds moved and branches swayed. A Marine could position himself with the sun at his back and still catch a beam entering through a canopy hole 40 feet to his left, striking his objective lens at an angle he never anticipated. The flash lasted a fraction of a second. Long enough. Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal exploited this with a consistency that suggests training rather than luck. Marine intelligence debriefs from January 1943, conducted as the 1st Marine Division rotated off the island and the Army's Americal Division took over, contain repeated references to what officers called optical targeting. The term appears in at least 4 separate battalion-level reports. One debrief from a scout sniper platoon leader in the 1st Marines described losing 2 men in a single week to what he assessed as deliberate counter-sniper fire directed at their optics. The Marines had been in concealed positions, stationary, and neither had fired. The platoon leader's conclusion, recorded without elaboration: the Japanese spotted the glass. He didn't speculate on method. The captured training manual explaining exactly how wouldn't reach his desk for another 3 months. The cruelest aspect of the problem involved timing. Dawn and dusk, the golden hours that competitive shooters prize for their warm angled light, produced the worst reflection conditions in jungle. Low-angle sunlight penetrated deeper under the canopy, traveling horizontally through gaps that high noon sun couldn't reach. A Marine occupying a position at 0600 hours, when the light angled in from the east at maybe 15 degrees above the horizon, presented his objective lens to incoming rays at precisely the geometry that maximized specular reflection. The scope became brightest at the exact hours when snipers preferred to shoot. Morning mist compounded the effect. Water droplets in the air scattered light into diffuse beams that found lens surfaces from unpredictable angles. A sniper who survived midday might die at sunset for reasons he never understood, killed by the same physics that made his scope useful in the first place. The solution couldn't come from Pittsburgh. Unertl had built the finest scope his craft permitted. Coatings required industrial capacity, and a sunshade required redesigning the mounting system. Neither modification could happen in a jungle camp on Guadalcanal with hand tools and salvaged materials. The Marines needed a different answer entirely, one that abandoned the assumption magnification remained essential to precision killing at jungle distances. Sometime in late November 1942, the exact date sits in no log anyone has found, a Marine on the Matanika River line cut a strip from a dead man's dungaree jacket, folded it twice, and tied it over the objective lens of his Unertl scope with a length of bootlace. He left a horizontal slit, roughly 3 millimeters wide, enough to see through at reduced brightness, not enough to throw a reflection that a Japanese observer could pick up at distance. The modification took about 90 seconds. It degraded light transmission by an estimated 70%. It also meant that the next morning, when his spotter watched a Japanese sniper fire 3 rounds into the position they'd vacated 10 minutes earlier, neither of them died. The dead Marine whose jacket provided the fabric had been a scout sniper. He'd been killed 2 days prior in a concealed position from which he never fired a shot. The records don't say whether the man who cut the cloth knew whose jacket it had been. By December, the improvisation had spread through the 1st Marine Division's scout sniper platoons with the organic speed of any idea that keeps people alive. Nobody issued a formal order or published a training bulletin. Snipers taught snipers, and the methods multiplied. Dungaree wraps gave way to strips of OD green undershirt material, which stretched tighter and stayed in place without cord. Some teams abandoned the slit approach entirely and simply capped the objective with fabric, removing the cover only at the moment of the shot and replacing it immediately after. A drill that added maybe 2 seconds to engagement time, but eliminated reflection completely between shots. On Cape Gloucester in late 1943, Marines from the 1st Division's 2nd deployment refined the concept further. Multiple after-action reports credit different men, and none of them cared about attribution, discovered that the metal from a C-ration can, cut with a K-bar knife and bent into a cylinder, could be friction-fitted over the end of the Unertl tube to create a sunshade extending roughly 2 inches forward of the objective lens. The tin's interior surface, already dark from the packing process, absorbed rather than reflected incoming light. It restricted the angle of incidence to something under 40 degrees from center, not as effective as a purpose-built hood, but enough to eliminate the worst of the low-angle dawn and dusk reflections that had killed men on Guadalcanal. These fixes addressed the reflection problem. They didn't touch the magnification problem. And by mid-1943, a growing number of scout sniper teams had stopped pretending they could fix what couldn't be fixed. Across New Georgia and Bougainville, in the dense kunai grass and secondary jungle of the northern Solomons, Marine snipers increasingly left the Unertl in their packs and fought with iron-sighted M1 Garands or unscoped Springfield 1903-03 rifles. The shift happened platoon by platoon, island by island, driven not by doctrine but by funerals. A scout sniper NCO on Bougainville in November 1943 told his debriefer that he'd stopped issuing scoped rifles for jungle patrols after his 3rd replacement sniper died in a month. His exact phrasing, recorded in the battalion's intelligence summary: "I can train a man to shoot iron sights in 2 weeks. I can't train him back to life." The debriefer noted no further comment. 3 men in 30 days, all carrying the best optic the Marine Corps owned, all dead before they justified its weight. The NCO made a decision that contradicted his training, his equipment table, and the institutional identity of his platoon. He made it because the alternative meant writing more letters. By Peleliu, in September 1944, the 1st Marine Division's scout sniper employment had formalized what Guadalcanal's survivors improvised. Jungle operations called for iron sights. Scopes came out for open ground, beach approaches, airfield perimeters, anywhere sight lines exceeded 200 yards, and the canopy broke open enough to make magnification an advantage rather than a liability. The Unertl rode in packs, wrapped in oiled cloth, protected with more care than some Marines extended to their sidearms. When terrain justified glass, the scope went on. When the jungle closed in, it came off. The pride attached to carrying a visible optic, that marker of elite status, had been burned away by something stronger than tradition. The men who survived the learning curve didn't talk about what replaced it. They carried iron sights into green darkness and came back out. The document measured roughly 5 by 7 inches, printed on rice paper so thin the ink bled through to the reverse side. Army intelligence catalogued it as item number 274-J in the Guadalcanal Captured Materials Index, filed in February 1943, alongside maps, codebooks, and a Japanese lieutenant's personal diary that contained nothing of military value. Item 2, 74-J contained everything. It arrived at Marine Corps Schools, Quantico, in April 1943 as part of a bulk translation batch. The translator assigned to it, a Nisei linguist whose name appears only as Sergeant K. Tanaka in the distribution memo, flagged it for priority review. What he'd found wasn't a field manual in the conventional sense. It read more like an instructor's lecture notes, organized under headings that translate roughly as Methods for Identifying and Engaging Enemy Precision Shooters in Covered Terrain. 11 sections. The 4th section, spanning 2 full pages, dealt exclusively with optical reflection as a targeting indicator. The text described the behavior of uncoated glass under jungle light conditions with a specificity that would have impressed an optical engineer. It distinguished between primary reflection, direct sunlight striking the objective lens, and secondary reflection, which it defined as ambient light scattered by wet foliage reaching the lens from oblique angles. It noted that secondary reflection produced a dimmer but more persistent signal than primary flash, and that trained observers should scan for a pale circle rather than a bright point. The document recommended that counter-sniper teams work in pairs, one man scanning with naked eyes at wide angle, the other ready to fire on the bearing called. Speed mattered more than precision on the first shot. The purpose of the initial round, the text stated, amounted to forcing the enemy sniper to move, and movement in dense vegetation produced noise that confirmed the position for a second, aimed shot. 2-round doctrine, flush, then kill. The Marines on the Matanikau, who died in concealed positions without firing, had faced men executing a trained sequence, not opportunists getting lucky. Post-war interrogations filled gaps the captured document left open. United States Strategic Bombing Survey teams, interviewing Japanese Army personnel on the home islands in late 1945 and early 1946, collected testimony from several former NCOs who had served in sniper or observer roles in the Solomons campaign. One sergeant from the 35th Infantry Brigade, interviewed at a processing center near Yokohama in December 1945, described a 3-day training exercise conducted on Shortland Island before his unit deployed to Guadalcanal. The exercise focused entirely on detecting optical equipment in jungle. Trainees practiced spotting binoculars, rifle scopes, and periscopes positioned at varying distances under different canopy densities. The sergeant stated that American scopes reflected more easily than Japanese, or captured British optics, and that his instructors attributed this to the absence of a lens hood. He used a Japanese term the interviewer translated as naked eye to describe the American scope's exposed objective, an unintentional irony, given that naked eyes turned out to be exactly what replaced it. The interrogation report carries no classification marking, which suggests it circulated freely within the intelligence community. Whether it reached anyone at Quantico who connected it to the captured training notes from 2 years earlier, The file doesn't indicate. A second interrogation, conducted on Guam in October 1945 with a former warrant officer from the 17th Army's headquarters staff, produced a broader admission. This officer, who had handled intelligence summaries rather than carrying a rifle, stated that American optical equipment across all categories reflected more than equivalent Japanese or German items his unit had examined. Binoculars, spotting scopes, rifle optics, rangefinders. He called it a consistent characteristic of American manufacture and attributed it to what he described as American confidence in material superiority, reducing attention to concealment details. The interviewer, an Army captain from the Military Intelligence Service, noted in his margin comments that the officer appeared to be offering a genuine analytical assessment rather than flattery or deflection. The captain's marginal note reads, "Subject seems to regard this as an engineering observation, not a criticism." An engineering observation from an enemy who spent 3 years trying to kill the men carrying that engineering. The Japanese identified the Unertl's naked lens as a systemic flaw, built doctrine around exploiting it, trained soldiers to detect it under specific light conditions, and confirmed after the war that the advantage held from first contact to last. They never needed to match American marksmanship. They just needed to see the glass. On Mount Suribachi's northern slope, in a network of tunnels blasted from volcanic sulfur rock, Japanese observers scanned the black sand beaches through narrow firing slits on the morning of February 19, 1945. They knew what to look for. Every man in the garrison's counter-sniper details had trained on the same doctrine that worked in the Solomons. Find the pale circle, call the bearing, flush and kill. They watched for glass. They watched for the telltale quarter-sized flash that had handed them Marine snipers, like gifts on Guadalcanal, on New Georgia, on Bougainville. The light that morning came harsh and flat off the Pacific, reflecting white against the volcanic ash, filling every crevice with diffuse glare. Perfect conditions for spotting an uncoated lens. The observers scanned. They kept scanning. The Marines below carried scopes. The observers never saw them. The Unertl that came ashore on Iwo Jima shared its name and its basic architecture with the scope that betrayed men on the Matanikau 3 years earlier. Almost nothing else matched. Bausch and Lomb had begun delivering single-layer magnesium fluoride-coated lenses to military optics contractors in mid-1943, and by early 1944, the coatings reached Unertl's shop in Pittsburgh through the Marine Corps procurement chain. The physics reversed. Where bare glass reflected 4% of incoming light, a single fluoride layer dropped that figure below 1.5%, enough to eliminate visible flash at any tactically relevant distance. The coating appeared as a faint blue-violet sheen on the lens surface, almost invisible unless you tilted the scope under direct light. Marines who'd carried the old uncoated models noticed immediately. The image looked slightly different, marginally less bright in absolute terms, but with reduced internal flare that actually improved contrast in high-glare environments. Volcanic ash and white coral, the dominant terrain surfaces of the Central Pacific island hopping campaign, produced exactly the kind of ambient glare that punished uncoated optics. The coating helped the shooter see and kept the enemy blind, both at once. But coatings alone didn't satisfy men who remembered what bare glass cost. By Iwo Jima, the field modifications born on Guadalcanal had evolved into semi-standardized equipment. Armory sections at division level, fabricated tubular sunshades from brass or aluminum stock, threaded to screw onto the Unertl's objective bell. These hoods extended roughly 3 inches forward of the lens, close to the proportions German and Japanese optical designers had used from the start. Some units added a second layer, a fine metal mesh or perforated disc fitted inside the hood's forward opening, reducing the aperture to a honeycomb pattern that broke up any residual reflection into fragments too small and too scattered to register as a coherent signal. The modern term for this device is kill flash. In February 1945, nobody called it anything. It had no nomenclature, no NSN, no official existence. Armorers built them from whatever metal they had. They worked. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima included experienced soldiers transferred from units that had fought in the Solomons and Marianas. Their counter-sniper doctrine remained unchanged. The same paired observer system, the same scan-for-glass methodology documented in Item 274-J. On an island with virtually no jungle canopy, where sight lines stretched hundreds of yards across open volcanic terrain, conditions should have favored optical detection even more than dense forest. Open ground and bright light over exposed positions. A captured Japanese after-action fragment recovered from a command bunker on Hill 382, undated, partially burned along one edge, contained a section on American sniper activity that the translator summarized as frustrated in tone. The author noted that American snipers appeared to operate with optical equipment, but that standard detection methods produced no reliable signatures. The phrase the translator rendered into English: "The reflection we trained to find does not appear." 6 words. 3 years of doctrine, exposed as obsolete in a single admission, scratched onto paper inside a bunker that smelled like sulfur and cordite and the wet sweetness of volcanic soil, decomposing alongside the dead. The men who wrote that training manual on optical detection, the men who turned 4% reflectivity into a killing system, had built something effective against the scope America fielded in 1942. They refined it, trained thousands of soldiers on it, deployed it across an entire theater of war, and watched it deliver results. The Marines lost men learning what the Japanese already knew. Then, the Marines fixed the problem with industrial coatings, improvised hardware, field ingenuity, and the institutional memory of funerals. The Japanese kept hunting for a flash that no longer existed, scanning through their firing slits on Suribachi, while coated glass watched them back. We solved a problem we should never have had. That line appears in a 1946 Marine Corps Equipment Board review of sniper optics, buried in a subsection on anti-reflective treatments. The author isn't named. The report carries 12 signatures on its cover page, and the sentence could belong to any of them. It sits between a table of light transmission values and a procurement recommendation for coated lenses as standard issue. No emphasis, no exclamation. Just a flat admission that American optical engineering in 1942 shipped a scope to the Pacific, with a flaw the Germans corrected in 1934 and the Japanese addressed before the invasion of Manchuria. Every military scope manufactured today carries the solution those Marines improvised with dead men's jackets and sea ration tins. The kill flash, that honeycomb mesh fitted over the objective lens, appears on the Leupold Mark V HD, the Schmidt and Bender PM2, the Nightforce ATACR, the Elkin Spectre carried by Canadian and Australian forces, the Hensoldt scopes issued to the Bundeswehr. Anti-reflective multi-coating stack 4, 5, 6 layers of metallic oxide on every air-to-glass surface, dropping reflection from 4% per element to fractions of a fraction. Sunshade's ship standard in the box. The United States military's current specification for rifle optics, MIL-PRF-32-5-7-0, revised most recently in 2021, contains an entire section on signature management that mandates maximum reflectance values, anti-reflection device compatibility, and glare reduction under specified solar angles. The language is bureaucratic, the math clinical. The requirement exists because of what happened along a river on Guadalcanal when a 30mm circle of uncoated Pittsburgh glass caught equatorial light and told a Japanese observer exactly where to shoot. The irony cuts in a direction nobody on that equipment board anticipated. Japan's counter-sniper doctrine, the paired observer teams, the flush and kill sequence, the meticulous training on optical detection, represented real tactical innovation. The Japanese military identified a real vulnerability in American equipment, developed a systematic method to exploit it, trained soldiers at scale, and deployed the capability across an entire theater. It worked. Marines died because of it. The doctrine forced the Corps to abandon its primary sniper optic in jungle operations for nearly 2 years, a period during which American scout snipers fought with iron sights against an enemy who had built his defensive positions specifically to defeat magnified observation. The Japanese won that particular engagement in the war within the war. Their counter-sniper methodology constituted one of the few areas where Japanese tactical doctrine demonstrably outperformed American practice during the first 18 months of the Pacific Campaign. And then, American industry erased the advantage in a coating laboratory. Magnesium fluoride, applied in a vacuum chamber at Bausch & Lomb's Rochester plant by technicians who never heard a shot fired, neutralized a doctrine that took years to develop and thousands of hours to train. The Japanese kept executing the doctrine on Iwo Jima. They executed it perfectly. The reflection they hunted had ceased to exist roughly 14 months before they started looking for it. They built the best defense anyone had ever constructed against uncoated glass, and uncoated glass stopped arriving in the Pacific in mid-1944. The defense outlived the vulnerability by exactly long enough to get its practitioners killed while scanning for a signal that coated lenses no longer produced. The Marines who came home carried something the specifications and procurement documents don't capture. 47 scout snipers from the 1st Marine Division's original Guadalcanal deployment served through Iwo Jima. The division's records track them imperfectly. Transfers, hospitalizations, redesignations muddy the count. Sources conflict on whether the number is 47 or 44. Either way, fewer than 50 men bridged the full arc from bare glass to coated lens, from dungaree-wrapped objectives to factory kill flash, from iron sights in green jungle to scoped rifles on black volcanic sand. Most of the men who learned the hard lessons didn't survive to see the solutions. The NCO on Bougainville, who stopped issuing scoped rifles after 3 dead replacements in 30 days, the one who told his debriefer he couldn't train a man back to life, shipped home in February 1944 with malaria and a combat fatigue diagnosis. He never returned to the Pacific. His last recorded statement in any Marine Corps file is the one already quoted. 7 words delivered to an intelligence officer in a tent that smelled like quinine and rain. I can train a man to shoot iron sights in 2 weeks. I can't train him back to life.